Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program from Washington. On today's show, the U.S. intelligence and the news media. Our guest, the investigative reporter, Jeremy Bigwood. Jeremy Bigwood, warm welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Jeremy, you have been researching the relationship between the U.S. intelligence and the news media for many years. When would you say that relationship started?
Basically, the relationship between the U.S. government and the U.S. news media started in the Second World War, and it basically emulated the British method of doing intelligence, in which, in many cases, journalists were actually working for British intelligence. And so during the Second World War, when you had these huge enemies, the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese, amongst others, the OSS was formed, which was the forerunner of the CIA, Office of Strategic Services. And in about 1942, 1943, they started employing journalists, actually paying journalists or paying their news organizations as sort of some kind of pass-through to keep these people working in their countries and have the money come through a legitimate mechanism, which was their news agencies. And there are some cases that have been found that are in the National Archives, the U.S. National Archives, and you can see where the OSS is employing people. After the Second World War, now remember other countries were doing this too, the Spanish, the Germans, a lot of people were doing this. After the Second World War, a lot of the relationships between journalism, especially U.S. journalists, and the intelligence agencies continued. So when the CIA was formed in 1947, that same relationship continued for many years, where you had many journalists, some say as many as 400, on the CIA payroll.
So, and what was the purpose of having journalists paid by the CIA or the previous organization to the CIA?
Well, basically, it has several functions. One of them is to receive very timely, very good information and material that would not be published. In the time of the Second World War, a lot of things were censored, so you couldn't really publish everything that you wanted to. And there was an incredible need to get, there was a need to get intelligence, and what better source than journalists who had access to, they're supposedly neutral and had access to all sides. There's also a propaganda value, too, to having journalists on the payroll. And that is if the CIA or another intelligence agency can give a journalist a tip or tell them exactly how to frame a story, that can have incredible power propagandistically.
In a way, was propaganda. And talk to me about the Church Committee hearings, and for an audience that don't necessarily know what was it about.
Yes, this is a pivotal time in the relationship between the CIA and the American press, and indeed the FBI and the American press. After Watergate, the Nixon resignation, there were a series of hearings to investigate the relationship between the Central Intelligence Agency and journalists, the FBI and journalists, and various intelligence agencies and journalists. And in this investigation, a lot of material was released. The names of the journalists who were participating, the names of the journalists who were actually on payroll, that was never released because some of those were still ongoing. But it was a really critical time because upon that release, right before then, there was sort of a feeling amongst many journalists that the U.S. was on the wrong path. It was Vietnam, and a lot of journalists who were on the payroll essentially moved off the payroll or got away from the Central Intelligence Agency even before the church committee hearings.
Exactly, because in your words you say that after that there was a profound rethinking role of the CIA and the journalists, not only by the journalists but also by the CIA. And then you say that what it came out was not to pay such journalists for the print media?
Yes, and I believe that took place for all media. The CIA came out with a proposal where they would no longer employ journalists or religious figures either. And there was a caveat to that. That was U.S. journalists. Now, around the world, they would continue to do so. They would continue to employ journalists around the world who worked directly for them. And there's another caveat, and it was really understood that journalists who wanted to share information with the CIA and would not be paid for it could continue to do that.
You mentioned that the CIA, as you said, they were still free to have foreign journalists on the payroll and also have U.S. and citizen stringers, for example, in order to work with the wire services. That was
right.
The way to go around.
That was the way to go around it to a certain degree, but you no longer had, I think after the Church Committee, you no longer had this incredible amount of journalists who were on the payroll. Major U.S. journalists. That didn't happen. And indeed, journalism rethought the situation, and there was a new impulse to sort of move into the direction of more or less neutral journalism. And amongst many journalists, they did not want this relationship with the CIA to continue. So there was a change. Now, what happens then is really interesting. Essentially, the CIA moves out of the picture, but later organizations like USAID and NED move in, and they start funding journalists, mainly in other countries, but this is a major shift.
You were talking about then, and let's talk about now. I think that your perception is that the CIA is not necessarily the most visible and the most rapid organization from the US government to go places to stand their presence or their influence in that country.
Basically, for regime change and for doing essentially controlling other countries or attempting to control other countries, the mechanism has generally recently been through something called OTI, which is the Office of Transition Initiatives. And what OTI does is that it's extremely agile, and it has a lot of money. It can insert itself into a country very rapidly and make changes. For instance, in Venezuela, put a bunch of young, upcoming journalists and students on the payroll, have them attend meetings in the United States, and generally have them push a U.S. agenda inside the country, which in the case of Venezuela would cause a lot of friction. And indeed, that happened there. In other places, for instance, OTI is in Honduras right now, trying to change the equation. I don't think they're going to be very successful there. I think in a place like Venezuela, they've been quite successful. In
Bolivia?
In Bolivia, OTI was in the past, but is no longer there. But USAID itself has had programs in Bolivia that have been against the Morales, or against Evo Morales even before he was president.
Programs like what?
Well, programs like funding parties that were against Evo Morales, essentially his MAS party.
When you listen to authorities, presidents or other type of authorities in Latin America, especially in progressive countries, repeatedly denouncing what they call the interference of the US government in their countries, is that real?
I think it's very real, yeah. It may not be real in every case, but there is a definite interference. One has to understand the relationship between the United States and Latin America it has changed a lot in the last couple of decades, especially the last decade.
In which way it changed?
Well, it's far more independent. You would never have had a country say no to a U.S. military base, like what happened with Manta in Ecuador with President Correa.
That at the end of the lease, they say, please go home.
Go home, yes. That just wouldn't have happened.
You were placing requests based on the Freedom of Information Act, which is a law that gives the right to request for the U.S. government some documents of what they did in the past. And you were placing that request on July 1st, 2009. You were submitting that request to the U.S. South Command. You were seeking the records, and I'm quoting your words, concerning the June 28th, 2009 coup d'etat that forcibly removed Honduras President Manuel Zelaya from office and flew him out of the country through the Soto Cano military base. I assume that Soto Cano is a U.S. military base.
It's a mixed U.S. and Honduran military base. Anything that happens within the base, the United States is going to know about. There's only one runway. And in this case, the recently kidnapped president, Zelaya, who'd just been overthrown and kidnapped and he was a prisoner aboard the presidential plane. It flew into Soto Cano, which is also called Palmarola, and he was still in his pajamas, apparently.
That's correct. He was in his pajamas.
In his pajamas. He didn't get out of the plane. But anyone who was manning the tower, and the U.S. mans the tower, and the Hondurans man the tower, and it's 24/7. There are a lot of U.S. troops. There's maybe around 1,000 troops.
U.S. troops.
U.S. troops there, of all various different entities, military and civilian. But basically, filed this FOIA request because I found it rather strange that after a coup, you would take the president to a U.S. base. And indeed, that became a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, and it's right now winding its way through the courts. It's been active for about 3 years. And essentially what I'm trying to find out is exactly what the U.S. military officials and maybe civilian officials on the base reported to Washington or to the Pentagon, the National Military Command Center specifically, about this plane that was bringing the president. They obviously knew that there had been a coup. What were they saying?
When the president
arrived. And he was on the tarmac for 20 minutes or so. Did they give some kind of permission for him to be flown to Costa Rica, or did they pretend not to know about it? Or that's what I'm looking for, essentially.
So the information hasn't come to you yet?
Hasn't come yet.
And the excuse or the rationale is?
There have been various excuses at various times, and it's basically we have a situation where this is in a court of law, and the government has produced a lot of paper, but it's a lot of irrelevant paper about things that were indeed happening in Honduras or in the region.
Is there any way for you to have the suspicion that if that plane who was bringing the kidnapped President Zelaya to that military base of Palmarola, the military officers there were reporting to higher officers here in Washington?
They really had to be. You couldn't not report a presidential plane right after a coup coming into your base. It just
without knowing.
I mean, you'd have to report something, and you'd have to know. I mean, it's the presidential plane. All presidential planes are monitored in Latin America by Southcom. This would have definitely had to be monitored. One of the things that they did release was a nice map showing the route of the plane, but there was no information with that map.
From 10 years, 1984 to 1994, you were a photojournalist in Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras. Have you had the chance to witness or to get information that the U.S. were clearly backing all the actions of the Contras?
Specifically, I haven't. The other people have really proved. I mean, that was a known. The Contras were basically a U.S. proxy force. We know that their operations were pretty much run by the Central Intelligence Agency.
By the CIA.
And everyone, there's no doubt about that.
And El Salvador, for example, death squads. What was your experience in terms of witnessing and reporting on that?
I was very lucky to be very close to the events in El Salvador specifically. I was covering the region for my photo agency, and when you're a photographer working for a photo agency in a small country, because El Salvador is a pretty small country, and you work there for 6 years or 7 years, I mean, you have access to a lot of things. So I was very lucky in that I was able to get many sides of what was transpiring there. Later, I've done a lot of Freedom of Information Act work on El Salvador, and I still haven't gotten a lot of the information that I'm really interested in. For instance, a few years after the war, President Clinton gave out medals for advisors who had served in El Salvador. And I understand that the amount of advisors who had served there was about 5,000 in that 12-year period. Now, you had
of the war, of the Civil War.
Of the Civil War, yes. So I'm still looking at that, and that's something that we really couldn't cover during that time period. Another thing that we couldn't cover was the cocaine traffic through the Air Force Base, especially the Air Force Academy.
The U.S. Air Force Base?
No, it was the Salvadoran Air Force Base, but it had a huge U.S. presence, and that was essentially part of the Contra War.
What you're telling me is that there was the usage of some military bases where they were bringing drugs, cocaine, going to the U.S., being sold in the U.S., and with that money they were financing the Contras or the groups that they were defending the U.S. interests in the region.
It was widely rumored at the time, and I believe it to be true. I don't have hard evidence, but just about all of the journalists had heard those rumors. Hardly anyone, because El Salvador was such a moving, it was such a dynamic situation. To investigate that would have been very dangerous, and no one had even investigated the U.S. advisors. And so there were other things that were very dangerous to do, just be there.
And there is this film that is called Kill the Messenger.
And that's about Gary Webb, yes.
And he ended up officially committing suicide after putting his nose in investigating the drug trafficking to finance those movements.
That's essentially what happened. Basically, the way it worked was very interesting. He came out with his book, and I had no relationship with him until many years after the book came out. I'd seen him, I'd read the book, and he was basically, the news media itself lined up against him. Much of the news media, not all of the news media, and they really criticized him, and they made it impossible for him to find work and essentially to live. So it was a similar thing that happened to Gary Webb that happened to people who were in the Communist Party in the U.S. during the 50s. They couldn't get work, they couldn't get driver's license, there were a lot of problems.
If you're saying that at least most of the media, the most visible media, the ones with the highest ratings,
New York Times, Washington Post,
and
LA
networks,
Times,
and the networks, I guess, were going against him, trying to uncover that situation that is absolutely irregular. Does it means that the media in the U.S. is not at the service of the general public, but at the service of the big interests like the U.S. government or the big corporations?
You could definitely argue that. I would certainly agree with that. I think that the major media now it gets very complicated because there are some really good reporters who do very good work. I think of like Dana Priest at the Washington Post.
And one of the issues that most of the Washington correspondents at the White House are complaining repeatedly is that the Barack Obama administration is one of the most secretive administration that they have covered, and one of the ones who have going after whistleblowers with the most draconian system. For example, Joe Biden, the president of the US, has called Julian Assange a cyber terrorist, and the rapporteur of the UN was investigating the situation that today Chelsea Manning has been treated before to be going through a jury, through a trial, was absolutely inhuman and was torture. What did it tell you?
I believe all of that is true. My own experience has been through the Freedom of Information Act. And since Barack Obama came in, it's gotten much more difficult to get responsive material. You still get a lot of paper, but it's not responsive. And apparently there have been, some journalists have been upset because FOIA requests often aren't just handled by the FOIA offices, but in various agencies, they go up to the top person who decides whether it's politically good for the United States or politically good for the Obama administration to release such material. And that's a real step backwards.
Being an investigative reporter, as you have been for decades,
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever been threatened or someone made you feel the heat?
I'd rather not talk about that.
We are living in a world where it's more and more difficult because of the social media, et cetera, to get only one version, the official version of the versions that certain groups in society want us to know. In that sense, when they're trying to crush the whistleblowers, with someone like the journalist in that film, Kill the Messenger, ended up committing suicide, what all those threats are telling about the state of democracy?
Well, the state of democracy in the United States, it's always been, it's never quite achieved what we would call democracy. But I don't think that that has really taken place, many other places either. I think that what you're seeing is the United States was a much more powerful superpower a few years ago, and I think you have it lashing out at just about anyone as it's getting used to being in a multipolar world. And I think this program is evidence of a multipolar world, because what you have is that you have news media from other places that are competing with the mainstream US media. And I think that's a great step forward.
Is there freedom of the press in the US?
I think generally I would say yes, because I'm still here.
Jeremy Bigwood, future plans?
I plan to continue this court case. I plan to continue working in my field. I have some major projects, investigative projects that I'm doing at the National Archives. National Archives is one of those rare examples of a government institution that seems to be doing pretty well. I mean, I get material that's pretty important from it. So that's my feeling.
Jeremy Bigwood, thanks very much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.